Hey, everybody, and welcome to yet another episode, thrill-packed episode of the Blind Spot podcast, where we examine science and philosophy and their intersections. Today, we're excited because it's our first guest. It's our first time we've had a guest, and we have the incomparable John Dunne with us. John holds the Distinguished Chair in Contemplative Humanities at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. John is a prolific writer on Buddhism, translator of Tibetan texts, in particular, adept in the Buddhist philosophy of mind, which is one of the things we're going to be discussing. So, you can look forward to a kind of a deep dive here into the overlap between Buddhism and science and philosophy, particularly as it relates to consciousness, but really as it relates to everything else. But before we go any further, I have to talk about something else that people may not know about Professor Dunne. Is that he is also a artist with a plasma rifle. John and I are gamers together, and we have done amazing things. We have fought together against giant robots in Sweden in the mid-'80s, and we have battled the giant insects on planets in Helldivers 2, and currently we are battling against the Terminids on I forget which planet in Warhammer 40,000, and speaking like this because all the characters are like, "Brother, we must destroy the Terminids." Yeah. So John and I have multiple lifetimes, and he's actually very good, I have to say. At one point, John told me that somewhere in the 80s he was like #1 ranked on Doom, and I was like, "Not quite. Of course you were."
Up there, yeah.
Up there, okay. Not #1, but up there. Okay, and with that little introduction, Evan, why don't you start us off with the conversation?
Yeah, great. Wonderful to have you here, John. I know absolutely nothing about gaming, so I won't pursue that.
Yeah, you should keep it that way.
Right. So, as you know, we on this podcast we talk about the relationship between science and human experience, and so far we've just been talking amongst ourselves, Adam, myself, and Marcelo, in a way that grows out of our book, The Blind Spot. But what we thought we would ask you to sort of start the ball rolling is from your perspective as a scholar of Buddhism and translator, practitioner, and somebody who's worked a lot in collaboration with scientists, how you think about the nature of science as, let's say, a way of investigating reality from a Buddhist perspective, from a perspective you could say both informed by classical Buddhist philosophy, but also Buddhism today. What is science from that perspective? What does it do? How should we understand it?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question.
Yeah, thought we'd start big.
Yeah, okay. So, in terms of Buddhism, one thing I should say is, of course, there's a lot of different kinds of Buddhism. And I'm not going to speak for all Buddhisms, and I'm not even going to speak for any particular Buddhism. I'm going to kind of give you my perspective, sort of drawing on particular strands of Buddhism. And those strands, a lot of my work has been on Indian Buddhism. So a lot of my translations are actually Sanskrit, not Tibetan. Adam, excuse me. And I've been inspired particularly by a kind of strand of Buddhism that the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, has kind of identified as the one that has the best chance of a good dialogue, actually, with science. And you find that in his book, The Universe in a Single Atom. And this strand of Buddhism really comes out of, first, a kind of critique of metaphysics that you find in Nagarjuna. And then a move to a kind of phenomenological move you find in what's called the Yogacara philosophy of philosophers in India like Asanga and Vasubandhu. So Nagarjuna is like 1st, 2nd century, Asanga, Vasubandhu, 3rd, 4th century. And then you get this epistemologist, Dharmakirti, my hero, around the 7th century.
Is it true that you're the only person who's translated Dharmakirti?
No. There are lots of, there's we have whole conferences on Dharmakirti, if you can believe it, like 300 people show up, So yeah, it's like a whole niche thing. But, and there's even niches within the niche, like Prajnakaragupta Everyone's excited about whoever the heck he is. But anyway, in that strand, what's interesting about that strand is something that His Holiness really emphasizes. And we've known this, Evan, you and I, through some of the Mind and Life meetings, which is the idea that it's actually an attitude towards scripture, but it points to, which I think is also something that in the history of science is important too, what is actually good evidence for something? Like what counts as good evidence? If the Buddha said that something is the case, is that good evidence? Or is what you actually experience perceptually through your five senses good evidence? And if there's a contradiction, which do you go with? In the case of Dharmakirti, so, most of the Indian traditions around him who were using similar epistemological tools, they would say that scripture counted as good evidence. What's the scripture? It's, we won't go into those details, but basically the things counted as what we could call scripture. And they were probative. They proved something. Dharmakirti was really radical. And what he said was, scriptures actually don't prove anything, ever. The only thing that proves something is your experience and inferences based on what you can perceive. That could be a long chain of inferences, but still, it's got to at some point come down to something that you can directly perceive, like a scientist, reading an fMRI printout or whatever, right? Something that looks like something that you can actually perceive. Looking at a gauge on an instrument, something that you can perceive. So there's a long series of inferences that ends in that observation, but you still have that observation, right? So Dharmakirti said, first of all, that if a scripture says something about something you can establish empirically in this way, let's use that word, empirical, and it contradicts what the Buddha said, you have to give up what the Buddha said. It's wrong. Like, that's wrong. Sorry, you've got to stop. And so His Holiness has said this repeatedly. But the thing is so just to step back here for a second and think about this just in kind of like the history of Buddhism, that doesn't mean everyone was on board with this idea. So Dharmakirti, eventually says, we don't even need scripture as a separate category. It's a special category of inference. And basically, the time you use scripture is when, if you're going to use it inferentially to try to establish something, you can't actually prove anything with it. But if essentially psychologically you need to believe something in order to continue practicing your practice and move along the spiritual path, then you're allowed to use scripture. But it's really just a form of inference. So we just said there's just perception and inference, not scripture as a separate means of knowing. But then pretty soon in Tibet, when this reaches Tibet, you see that the Tibetans actually say, oh, well, there's three kinds of, means of knowing, three sources of valid knowledge, perception, empirical inference, and scripture. Wait a second, what happened to that? And then when I remember some years ago when I was at Embry and the Dalai Lama is talking about this, and he's there's a kind of a room, and in the front of the room, of course, is the monks, the distinguished monks, maybe 6 or 7 monks are sitting right in front of him, in front of the room, and he says, so if and they have this cosmology of what's called Mount Meru, the central axial mountain of the universe, or at least of our world system. Actually, there are many Mount Merus, but in our world system, there is a central axial mountain, like the center of the galaxy or something. And so he says, well, if science can show us that Mount Meru doesn't exist, that it contradicts empirical evidence, we just have to throw it out. And he makes this gesture with his hand, like sweeping gesture. And the whole front row of monks goes, whoa, they kind of lean back like, wait a second. And that was really emblematic. I've been at other meetings as well where, contemporary Tibetan scholars say, hey, wait a second, I'm not really on board with this idea, actually. So it's important to recognize that even though you have this strand within Buddhism that is a very strong empirical strand, which says the only thing you can accept is what you can establish empirically, that doesn't mean that all Buddhists are on board with it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So from the Buddhist standpoint, then when you look at science, it looks a lot like that. However, that doesn't mean that science really works that way either. Like, it's not so simple that scientists, as we know, sociologically, simply are operating on the best evidence, right? Or the best explanation to the evidence that they have available. There's a lot of other things going on, and institutional rivalries, who's going to pay my, who's going to, where's my paycheck coming from, who's that nasty guy with the beard that I really don't like, and all this kind of stuff. So, it's not that simple really, but in principle, it looks pretty similar. The difference, however, and this is, I think, a key point that I've written about as well, is that the purpose of the kind of inquiry into what we can observe that Buddhists engage in, for example, especially around the mind, but they had theories about matter, as what we would think of as matter as well, right? They had atomic theories and so on. The purpose of those inquiries, especially the inquiries about the nature of our minds, is actually to eliminate suffering and to reach maximal flourishing. It's not just to find the truth, so to speak. In a certain way, actually, it is to discover that there isn't that kind of objective absolute truth, and that the quest for that kind of objective absolute truth is part of the problem, actually. So when you're motivated, when the motivation is not to just find an objective absolute truth, but to find what works, so to speak, to transform the mind in a way that alleviates suffering and enhances flourishing, then part of what you get to, and what I think has happened for Buddhists, is that you get to a certain sort of set of systems. And of course, there are institutional inertia in Buddhism too. You get to a set of systems that explain things well enough to get people to kind of keep advancing along the path such that they're experiencing less suffering and flourishing a little more. And you don't really need to revise beyond that point, because your goal is not to come up with kind of, the final single explanation of anything, some kind of unified field theory, or the final absolute truth about the nature of matter. Your goal is to make people better. So therefore, a big distinction between Buddhism and science is what its motivations appear to be. And in Buddhism, the problem with that, of course, is that it does lead to like a lack of theory revision. So in certain regards, we haven't seen serious theory revision in Buddhist context for many centuries. But the other thing that it does lead to in Buddhism, which I think is the challenge for science, is it basically says theories are theories. Our theories, our maps are not reality. And this is where it really aligns with the blind spot. The map is not the territory. The model is just a model. And the more we cling to the models, the more we think they're giving us some kind of absolute truth, the more difficult things will become, the more problematic things will become. And in a certain way, you could say the more suffering we will have.
I want to pursue that a little bit because it connects to something you've written about specifically with Dharmakirti. So you've written about Dharmakirti as a thinker who has a kind of sliding scale, I think is your term, sliding scale of analysis. So when you were describing his saying that perception and inference should be relied on even in cases that contradict scripture, Dharmakirti might be understood as offering that at a more, let's say, realist level of analysis, where the idea is that, causality is real. There is a world out there made up of, momentary particulars, and we sort of take that for granted. But then, as you've written about, Dharmakirti ascends the analytic scale and calls even that into question. And that's what you were just talking about with the way that theories and models are constructions, and they don't sort of, attach onto some independent absolute reality. So from that perspective of a Buddhist view of conceptuality as constructive, how would you see that, let's say, critically impinging on science? Particularly, science as we understand it today, which, bears some resemblance to certain investigative practices in India of the time of Dharmakirti, but of course, is also different in a number of ways. So what would be the perspective there?
Yeah, that's another great question, which is probably another book length response, but
that's okay.
Yeah. So just to reiterate what you're saying, this idea of a kind of sliding scale, which is largely accepted. There are some people who contest this idea, in the community of people who work on Dharmakirti, but mostly it's pretty largely accepted that he's got different levels of analysis that are in a hierarchy. And certainly the kind of downstream use of Dharmakirti, which is, I think, for our purposes, especially important, where it gets combined with the kind of anti-metaphysics of Nagarjuna and what's called the Madhyamaka philosophy, or the middle way philosophy. Then it's very explicitly in a kind of hierarchy. So one way to think about that in Dharmakirti is when he's laying out his basic kind of epistemology, which goes with an ontology. It's like, and this is key actually to understand, how I would respond to what you're saying is that ontology doesn't come first, actually. Epistemology comes first, or what we would call epistemology. They don't really separate those, right? In other words,
John, can I just stop there just so, for the audience that could make sure that they're with us on this. So, and this is really important for me as a physicist, right? So ontology is, so the branch of philosophy about what is, like what furniture is in God's universe, right? And epistemology is, how do you know about the furniture in God's universe? And the interesting thing is that for physicists, we always start with ontology. Like we think like, you've got to decide like, well, is it quarks and leptons or is it strings? The ideal of the physicists going back to Newton was to lay out the ontology, lay out the things that the universe is made of, and then lay out their relationships, and then you could build everything from there. And the epistemology was like, it's kind of important, but not really that important. Once you got the ontology and the theory, you're kind of done. You don't even really have to go out and look. You could do it in a dark room.
And that's interesting. I wonder if that's really true of physics, actually. But that's a separate discussion. I think it might be now, but if you're thinking like the early physicists, weren't they kind of observing things, and then they were saying, this must be what's real out there. No, but anyway, I'm gonna. We won't have a history of physics discussion right now, but this is what I mean. Basically, is you start from experience. So you have what you have is something is impinging in a sense on your senses, and then what's impinging on your senses needs interpretation. So on Dharmakirti's account, there's a kind of non-conceptual, it's not uninterpreted in the sense that I've got a body with particular sense faculties, I've got appetites, I've got goals and desires, and they all affect that first impression, sense impression, that he describes as non-conceptual, specifically in the sense that it doesn't involve repeatability, meaning it doesn't involve, this is that again, right? This is blue again. So for him, concepts are always about sort of connecting to past experience and projecting into the future about what this thing is capable of. So in other words, it's kind of not just a prediction, it's also an historical account, if you like. Like when I say that something blue is blue, I mean, it's got certain kinds of causes and it produces certain kinds of effects. And that's really what the word blue means when I interpret what I'm seeing as blue. So that conceptual moment involves a kind of repetition. This is blue again. This is blue again. This is blue again. And there's a process by which we, come to learn these things. When I conceptualize in that fashion, I'm already introducing a certain kind of goal orientation into my concepts, because I have, sort of the important thing here. I'm just going to hold up this like ceramic lid to my, to my cup here, and I say to you, what color it is, and you say
blue.
It's blue, right? But actually, I think you can see it's not just blue, is it? It's like got little reflections in it and stuff like that. So that's treated right now, because I primed you to pay attention in a particular way. That's treated as noise, right? All of that stuff is. If I ask you what shape is it, you say
circular.
It's round, but actually it's not round in your perspective. It's actually kind of oval because of the shape, the way I'm holding it to you. But that's treated as noise too, right? So what's going on there is that the active conceptualization is in a sense filtering out particularities of the immediate situation, and then focusing on things that are based upon past experience and also predictions of what will happen next, right? So, in the case of this, the predictions maybe are not that, well, one thing is, we know it'll fit nicely on top of my cup, as an example. But if it's something I identify as fire, then I know I have other sets of predictions of things that I could do. But I would only identify it as fire, for example. I'd only identify something as fire because I'm interested in fire. So in Dharmakirti's context, the first point here that is really even at a quite low level of analysis is that when I'm conceptualizing, I am not picking out what this thing really is. This thing is not inherently blue or inherently round. That's a way of taking the contents of my experience and interpreting it for action in the world, for practical action in the world.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not intrinsically blue, and it's not only blue, obviously, and it's not only round. In fact, the point here is there's an infinite number of possible interpretations of this thing. I could call it an infinite number of things, but I can't call it anything. In other words, what I mean by that is my choices are constrained. So I can't call it an elephant in the proper use of that term. I can't call it Adam Frank. It looks a little like, no, not really. But,
it's not wearing a Mets hat.
But I'm constrained. So this is the kind of baseline level here is that when I'm using concepts, I'm giving a kind of causally based account of where a thing came from and what it's capable of in the future. And I'm doing that because I'm interested in doing something in the future. Or maybe I'm interested in something about the past, but mostly I'm interested in doing something in the future. But when I do that, I'm ignoring a whole bunch of things that are particular to that thing in that moment, in that experience. And I'm treating all that stuff as noise so that I can focus on the causal properties that I think are going to accomplish what I want, right? But I can't just... But still, my choices are constrained. So within those constraints, there's an infinite number of possible conceptualizations. I just want to make that clear before I say, is that clear? Does that make sense?
Yeah. It might be worth just making a connection for listeners. So within the Indian context, that viewpoint is critical of the idea that we see, for example, in the Nyaya school of philosophy, which is that there is a outside objective structure to reality where there are universals like or there are qualities like blueness, and there are then universals and they're instantiated in particulars, and the structure of cognitive processing is successful to the extent that it reflects the actual structure of the world. And that way of, let's call it just realist, that way of thinking as a realist, I think is kind of a default way of thinking in science. It's not the only way that scientists think, but you could say it's kind of a default view that, there are natural kinds, there are objective causal relations, there are, universal laws, universal principles. So Dharmakirti already, just in the way that you've articulated his understanding of concepts and categorization, implies a very, you could say, critical, you might say anti-realist, you might say pragmatist critique of that kind of default realism that we see science underpinning in our own culture today.
Yeah, because that's what, just to add quickly, because certainly for physicists, right? If you ask, like, what is that cup? Well, ultimately the cup is, atoms, which are made of protons, which are made of. So, certainly from the physics point of view, there's idea that there is a fundamental level of reality that we can base everything, we can reduce it all to. And so, yeah, you might have, and then we can take into account the fact that it's not circular. It doesn't appear circular, but appears, oval, because we can, do the projective geometry, etc. But right, physicists certainly want to argue that there is some, facts to be known that are independent of whatever needs you have or perspective you have. So, yeah, so how would Dharmakirti sort of address that?
Yeah, so as Evan said, so this sometimes people, when they talk about concept formation these days, they might refer to this as a classical view or the Platonic view, which is that basically categories or sets or natural kinds are kind of real things in the world out there, and we're just discovering them. But Dharmakirti's point is that we are always making them. There are no natural kinds. This is quite challenging for many people, including scientists. But in other words, what we have is just particular events in space-time that are actually unique. And yet we can categorize them successfully. And we know empirically that we can categorize them successfully to act in the world. But when we're doing that conceptualization or categorization, that's in us. That's not a thing out in the world. There are constraints. That's one metaphor we can use. There's something that makes it such that we can't just say anything we want, right? We can't just, make shit up, even though that is rather popular these days. But, we can't just do that if we want to actually, if I believe, that the moon really is just made out of green cheese, or it doesn't exist at all, and then I'm going to go try and prove that, well, I could go and try, but let's just assume that my experience will not line up with my claim, right?
Right.
So in a sense, when I'm making my categories, there are definitely constraints on what I can do, but those categories don't exist out there. They are products of the human mind. And that's key. Like, our models are the way reality is showing up to us. And that doesn't mean that they're arbitrary. That doesn't mean that they don't work. They work to a certain point. Although when we get to the limits of our human capacities, that may be a point where they start to get really weird, actually. And they stop working. When we start to move beyond.
Wait, John, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I just want to stop because I just want to repeat what you just said, because I think it's so important. And tell me if I'm getting this wrong. Our models are just how reality, or reflect how reality shows up to us, not reality as it exists in some timeless, perfect God's eye view, right? Is that
exactly? Yes. And so part of the way, and a key for Dharmakirti, a really key way that reality shows up to us is causally. It looks like things are causal. And for him, he even goes to the point, and this is like, side note, this is the thing that in my conversations with Giulio Tononi, the consciousness researcher, this is one of the things that's made me think he might be a reincarnation of Dharmakirti, because it's like reality is causal, right? This is Giulio's thing. It's absolutely that's what it means for a thing to be real, is it's causal. And
what do you mean by that? You mean that it's causal because it comes from something else.
It produces effects, which means that it has to also be itself an effect.
Although just to interject there, maybe we don't want to go down that path, or maybe we do. On Tononi's view, cause-effect structure is intrinsic to physics, intrinsic to information, and intrinsic to consciousness in a realist sense. And I don't think that's the case for Dharmakirti at that higher level of analysis, right?
That's exactly where I'm headed. Exactly.
Okay.
So
I just want to interject for our listeners who may not know, these guys are talking about Tononi's integrated information
theory of consciousness,
which is considered by many to be like the contender for the theory of, but for a lot of, so there's like
a very controversial theory,
right? But there are people who claim, and a lot of people claim, like, oh my God, we finally found it. It's IIT. Is it so? Okay, I just wanted to let people know that integrated information theory is considered by many to be the strong contender for a theory of consciousness. I'm not sure if anybody here believes that, but
I think it's intriguing, and I think Anil Seth's kind of modifications to it are intriguing. So certainly some, it's got something to say for it.
To point out for our listeners, we do have a critique of it in the blind spot
in the book, and I also really like your critique, but without getting too distracted there, I think one point of the critiques, this might be a critique you raised, although I'm not sure, but it's something you just raised, Evan, which is, so Dharmakirti will definitely say if we just kind of, and again, this is a key point here, by the way, is this is a consensual process. This is conceptualization is not just me. Conceptualization involves learning. It involves learning from my experience, but it also involves learning from other humans and like kind of checking with each other. It's like, hey, do you see, the one example that's really interesting about hallucination is, the two drunk guys. One guy says, do you see two moons? And the other guy says, yeah. And, is that like reality is in a certain way where we all see two moons? Well, in a way, yes. Like, it's all showing up to us in a particular way. And one way it shows up to us is causal. And so Dharmakirti says we have two ways of knowing things. We can perceive things, and we can infer things based on what we perceive, if it's a valid inference, if it's a sound inference. And then he says, and so that means there are things that are, the things that we perceive are causally efficient things that are impacting our senses. So the way we know at the baseline that something's real is that it's produced an effect. Specifically, it's produced a sense impression, right? And that's how we know that something is real. But that thing that produces a sense perception is totally unique, actually. It's not the same as anything else. But we can ignore its differences among other things, and we can conceptualize it by ignoring the differences and just focusing on the way it produces effects that for our purposes are in a sense good enough. Like I get warm. Everything we call fire is actually unique and different, but it's good enough. When I say I feel warm, I'm also doing the same thing with my own experience, and that's good enough. I've achieved my goal. And then he says inferences are not talking about real things. It's talking about constructed things, concepts, right? So because inference is always conceptual. So concepts aren't real, but if they're grounded in our experience, our causally based experience, then they work. And that gives us successful knowledge. Because really the criterion of what it means to have, valid knowledge or sound knowledge or reliable knowledge is that it enables us to achieve our goals. That's the key thing. So then Dharmakirti says, okay, so that's, we got these two ways of knowing, which means we have two kinds of things. We have causally efficient particulars that impinge our senses directly or indirectly. And we have inferences based on, constructed concepts that we construct. And then he raises his own objection. So, in Indian style philosophy, they raise objections. It's not like someone else is doing this, forcing him to write an objection in his text. You have to, the teacher said, you have to write. It's that he raises an objection. And the objection is, what do you mean about causality? What are you talking about? And he says, well, you plant a seed and you get a sprout. And then the objector responds by saying, but that's just conventional. So this objector by the commentators is always kind of identified as a Madhyamaka. Remember the philosophy of Nagarjuna, the middle way philosophy, which basically is really strongly anti-realist, really a kind of anti-metaphysics, right? So the Madhyamaka is saying causality is not real. It's not ultimately real. And Dharmakirti then has this great phrase in Sanskrit, astu yata tata, which David Eckel many years ago made a t-shirt for some meeting, I can't remember. And on the back, it has the Sanskrit, and on the front, it says a really good translation of this phrase, which is, whatever. Causality is not really real. Whatever. Because in other words, yeah, okay, it's not really real, but in our experience, that's how the world shows up in our experience. So as long as we remember, so in a certain way, Dharmakirti is being playful, and he's also trying to not lose a certain audience, right, of people who really think causality is real, because he's trying to write some of the idea of these multiple levels of analyses is you're trying to lead people down the primrose path, basically, to the point where they give up their realism, their objectivist accounts of the world, and now they treat them as, hopefully, as pragmatic models that get us what we want, right?
Well, an important point here, John, just I also want to add that these, right. So I think it's awesome, right, that the whatever is kind of like, yeah, well, that's a level of description. Now here's a higher level description, because as you said, the difference between Buddhism and science and its history was that Buddhism was, and this is a word I learned, I love it, salvetic, right? The purpose of Buddhism was to save you from your delusion, save you from your suffering. And so ascending these levels is not just, oh, I'm getting better analysis about what is real or what the world is like. You're also being led to renouncing your attachments and your aversions so that you can be truly free as well. So it's interesting that it plays both those roles. On the one hand, it is trying to get a better philosophy about what's going on, but also he's like, yeah, he's saying whatever, because now let's go to the next level, and the next level will make you a little more free from suffering. I mean, is that right?
I think the whatever is kind of a twofold, it kind of points in two different directions. One of them is, does it matter whether causality is ultimately real? Actually, does that, if what we're trying to do is, achieve our goals, and when we say that, what we mean we're talking about the standpoint of human experience, that within human experience, we're kind of, get to a certain experience. So if the world shows up to us as causal, and all of our attempts to kind of interpret it another way in terms of our experience doesn't work, then it seems like, well, that's a pretty good place. That's going to become an axiom for us at a certain level of analysis.
Right.
Right. And then, so it doesn't matter whether it's ultimately real or not. But then if we think that this way of conceptualizing our experience, this map, causality is part of the map. If we then think that that's the reality, that this feature of our map is the way reality actually is, then we are confusing ourselves. We're confusing ourselves because we're mistaking the map for the territory, but also we're kind of locking ourselves into an account of the world that is only one possible account. And there may be other accounts that, when we have other purposes, are better. It'd be a little like, let's say I have a map, or I've got like Google Maps on my phone, and I go out in the street and I'm trying to walk in different directions, and on the phone, the roads are all yellow, and the pavement is gray. Like, what's wrong here? Like, this should be yellow, right? Or I'm walking down the street and there's, a statue or a monument that's not on the map. And it's like, wait, what's wrong? That monument can't be real. It's not on the map. I mean, how stupid would that be, right? But that's, in a way, when we take our maps as the objective account of reality, then it makes us actually worse at science. Because
exactly.
We see something, or something comes up that contradicts, in our calculations or what have you, that contradicts our account. And then, especially when we push those accounts to some kind of absolute limit, they start to fall apart. And then we think, oh, the problem is that somehow we don't have the right map. Instead of thinking, well, the problem is that it's a map.
Or people try and hold on to the map. We had a meeting a few years ago at Berkeley called Physics, Buddhism, and Philosophy Redux. And it was a great meeting of philosophers and physicists and Buddhist scholars, and John was one, and all of us here, and Marcelo was there as well. We're at that, and this is where that's the first place I'd ever heard this idea of Dharma Kirtis, and it just struck me as so relevant because, like with things with quantum mechanics, right? With quantum mechanics, there was this change in how we got a new map, but people were like, where measurement became central, the measurer, the observer, the agent became central. And people were like, no, I want my old map. And they went through enormous mental gymnastics, like the many worlds interpretation, to try and preserve the features on their old map. And so, it strikes me that this willingness to be like, no, now we'll get a new map. And the new map's not going to look like the old map as you ascend the levels.
So let me push this one step further, because I know John can go there, and I want to hear him. I want to hear him say this, especially for our audience. So you might think that this is a relatively easy message to digest if you're talking about, say, quantum physics, but everything that you've been saying, of course, applies to the mind and to the map maker. So we don't want to think, oh, there's this thing called the mind, this category of really existent mental phenomena that is an intrinsic map producer. In reality is just some construction of that, because everything that's said about causality and the nature of phenomena applies to what we're calling the mind. So take it a step further into how this applies to consciousness and mental phenomena.
Okay, that's how many books?
I'm giving you big ones here. Big questions.
Another 10 minutes. So if you want to take a 10-minute run on this, go for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know. Feel free to interrupt me. That's a really good question, Evan. So one thing to remember that's, I think, important just in the history of, the development of Buddhism is that Buddhism started with a way of thinking about the mind. So Buddhism, was interested in knowing things, so to speak. So in a classical term, it actually comes originally from the Bhagavad Gita, is the idea that there are different styles of paths or spiritual paths. And one style is what's called the Jnana Marga, a path of knowing. And Buddhism was not the only one in India. There were several. Well, Evan mentioned one called the Nyaya school. You could almost translate that as the reasoning school or the logic school. And the idea is that basically what will set you free is knowing. Knowing what? Well, basically knowing reality. But in the Buddhist case, you could say it's knowing that there isn't a reality, depending on which level of analysis you're at. But also at a very basic low level of reality, of analysis rather, it is, being able to very clearly account for what's happening in experience, to categorize it in ways that are efficient and effective for meeting our goals. And in early Buddhism, this is treated in a pretty objectivist way, where you get what's called in Sanskrit, the Abhidharma, or in Pali, which is the language of the modern Theravada tradition, an ancient language, Abhidhamma. It's kind of like street Sanskrit, so to speak. So in that account, then, there are these entities, or rather elements, you can say, of the mind-body system. And those elements of the mind-body system have, especially according to a particular approach, are really treated pretty objectively. Like, they have their own intrinsic identity or intrinsic nature called the swabhava. And they're described as dharmas. And the etymology that's given for these elements is as a dharma is swaswabhavam dharti iti dharmaha, which means a dharma is that which holds its own intrinsic nature. It has its own intrinsic nature. So it's like objective, basically. And there are categories of dharmas that exist objectively, right? They're real things in the world. So all subsequent Buddhist philosophers kind of inherit that system and need to work with that system. And one way to think about what happens eventually is that system, instead of being treated as objectively, is treated more like a map, more like a model. That's not what's happening. It's not intrinsically the account. And even some early versions of the Abhidharma seem to be doing that already. Like, hey, this is just one map, just one model. So with that in place, then, when we look at the mapping of the mind, one of the key kind of challenges for the mapping of the mind is how you observe the mind. How actually is it possible to observe the mind? And this eventually leads to accounts that start to emphasize more and more a certain version of meta-awareness, which is a capacity to, in a sense, almost observe the mind out of the corner of your eye, so to speak, without taking a standpoint from any particular element of the mind, including even the sense of subjectivity itself. So as that develops, part of what then happens is raising the question, well, is that structure of a sense of a subject observing objects, including a sense like I'm a subject observing my own mind,
right?
If I do that, for example, then I can't be, how do I observe the subject?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Then I have to be another subject observing the subject, another subject observing the subject, observing the subject, observing the subject, right? I get into an infinite regress. So what starts to emerge are sort of theories about a kind of meta-awareness that it has reflexivity, where, meaning it's like grammatical reflexivity. It's that the transitive act of knowing, I know that, just becomes an intransitive act. Right? Which is hard to translate in English because we don't have reflexive constructions. But in Spanish and French, you do. Instead of saying je vois ça, you can say ça se voit. I see that, but that like sees itself with this reflexive pronoun se. Or in Spanish, yo hablo español, or you can say español se habla aquí, right? Instead of saying I speak Spanish, Spanish sort of speaks itself. So the mind knows itself, but already in English, that sounds like it's the mind knowing itself as an object, and that would be transitive. So this is intransitive knowing, right? So that kind of reflexive, that theory starts to emerge kind of somewhat naturally out of the attempt to observe the mind. But then with the kind of Dharmakirtian account, which becomes very influential, really hard to overemphasize how influential that style becomes for late Indian Buddhism and then Tibetan Buddhism. Then the question is, well, am I dealing with real categories of mind as well? And the answer is no. Like, nope. All of those, those various Abhidharma categories which are quite sophisticated, about attention, about different affective elements, about how they all work together in a moment of cognition. That's all just also a map. But then the key is, like you say, well, how do you know those are happening? Like if we have a feature of attention, that is something that's blocking distraction, right? We say that's one of the elements. It's the distraction blocker, which is in Sanskrit smrti, and it's avikshepaka karmika, that which has the function of blocking distraction. And that's what we translate as mindfulness, actually,
Right.
interestingly.
Right.
Smrti or sati, smrti in Sanskrit, sati in Pali. So the distraction, how do you know that's happening? Well, you'd say causally. I see there's this causal account. But again, causality is how our own experience is showing up to us. Then the final thing would be, well, how do you know you're even having experience? Right? That experience itself is even happening. And in the end, there's kind of a bifurcation here. There are going to be those who just say, even non-causally, in the moment, it's just presenting. It's like a mere presenting in the moment. It's not in time. It's like timeless. It's outside of time. There's the 3 times, past, present, and future. This is in the 4th time, this timeless time. It's not in space. It's not, and so that particular account, really, in a sense, how to put it, it puts us in a situation where we're no longer kind of operating empirically, right? Because we're no longer in a world where we're trying to do anything anymore. So that's not, it becomes a kind of baseline foundationless foundation, as they say, for certain epistemological claims, but it's kind of contradictory because it's outside of space-time. So, or like space-time kind of fall away in that context. So how is that relevant to actually doing anything?
John, can I ask, this was also, I mean, for my own, as a practitioner, as a junior cadet practitioner, this formless form, this, it wasn't, or was this, in some sense, the fruits of also contemplative practice, that the deepest levels of contemplative practice, that's, the contentless, that's like,
yes. Yeah, there were definitely styles of practice.
At that point, you're beyond ideas because, once in the deepest contemplative practice, the most adept contemplative practice, that's actually where you get to. I mean, that's what I read when I'm reading. Not that I've ever done.
Yeah, you could say it's clearly the product of practices and the product of a certain kind of anti-metaphysical metaphysics, and like a deconstructive metaphysics. That's actually, to use Wittgenstein's, kind of expression, trying to, kick away the ladder, so to speak.
Right.
You're using philosophy to undo philosophy. You're using the burning intellect to burn up the wood, so to speak, and burn up itself in a certain way. So what that leads to then is a position in which even if we don't go that far, what does definitely come into question is even the structure of subject-object knowing. And the claim will be that that structure is for Dharmakirtian philosophy. There are 2 kinds of errors. One of them is a conceptual error where we see it's dark outside. I'm in a place where there are often snakes, and I'm walking down the path, and I see a snake, but it's actually a rope. And when I look more carefully, I see it's a rope. So I just misidentified, so to speak, my sensory content.
Right.
But there's also a kind of error where, you take a stick and you put it in water, and under the right refractory conditions, it looks bent. And when you give an honest account of the way it's showing up in your mind, you say, it looks bent. Yeah, it does look bent. And that's a non-conceptual error. You can't straighten that out. You can't make it look straight by thinking. If you're drunk and you're seeing 2 moons, you can know that there aren't 2 moons, but you can't make the 2 moons go away. Right? So that's a non-conceptual error. And so the claim will be that the structure, subject-object structure of our experience is a non-conceptual error. It's built into, so this is like pointing to the kind of the limits of human cognition. It's like being a human, this is how the world's going to show up to you.
Yeah,
it's going to show up to you like you're in here and the world is out there. And that actually may not be really accurate. It may not hold up under analysis, may not withstand analysis is the term they use. That's the way it's going to show up as a human. Yeah. So you've got to learn how to work with that. That's part of the way your map is. That's going to be built into your map, right? You can't get rid of that. If you do mapping, you're going to have that. That's the claim. And so that, in a certain way, or maybe, I don't know, can you have like non-dual maps? So what we're talking about is the idea that the mind is ultimately non-dual in its nature.
Right.
Can you have a non-dual map?
I think that's an interesting question. I mean, we should probably, we're almost at the end, or we are kind of at the end. So let's actually leave that question. Can there be non-dual maps? Because, when we wrote The Blind Spot, we were interested in like what's beyond the blind spot. What does science look like beyond the blind spot? And so it's an interesting, maybe there can't be non-dual scientific maps. Maybe there are ways of naturalizing, as people would say that. But why don't we leave that as an open question? What I'm going to suggest actually to our listeners is, we can certainly have John back. If you want, we could just play video games and you could watch us. I don't think anybody's interested in that. Or we have to start a Twitch account for that. But if you have questions for John, why don't you send them to us? And then the next time John comes on, if he's kind enough to join us again, we could take those up. So, but for right now, probably we're at a good point to sort of finish up. So I will thank you, John.
It's a pleasure.
And
yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for coming on, and we will see you next time. Evan, anything else you want to add before?
No, I think that's a good place to stop. Can there be a non-dual science? That's the question now.
Yeah. I don't know.
Don't know about that one.
I don't know.
Question for another time.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
We just launched 1,000 papers were launched with that question. Yeah. All right, everybody. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time.